All right, today's lesson is going to take us to chapters 6 through 8 of the book of Judges. And we're going to look at the reluctant judge, Gideon. Now, it isn't likely that any of you are going to be called on to lead an army into battle anytime soon, but God gives us opportunities to win battles for Him. In fact, we are involved in a war every day of our lives. It's a war for our love and our allegiance. And the greatest battle in that war will very often be centered around our thoughts and our emotions. Sometimes it seems as though we're going to be entangled in moral and spiritual warfare forever. Well, our daily struggles to trust and obey the Lord have a purpose. He's training us to win the one great battle that really counts. That's the battle between Himself and Satan for control of our soul. We know that Jesus is stronger than the devil. When we put our trust in the Lord, we can depend on Him to help us win the battles that we face. Well, the subject of our lesson today is a rather reluctant warrior by the name of Gideon. Like Gideon, we can sometimes feel overwhelmed, but remember, He who was in you is greater than he who was in the world. Now, when the Israelites finally entered the promised land, and they failed to take all the land that God had promised to give them. Instead, they had taken the high country, but they never bothered to go to the more fertile land on the coast. And since the high country in Israel doesn't have a lot of soil that is suitable for farming, you need to make the best of what little bit you have. Now, after wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, the Israelites suddenly find themselves in an agricultural society. Up until that point, they had been living as nomads. They really didn't know anything about growing things. I mean, after all, they'd never been in a place long enough to grow plants, and they really didn't need to. You see, God had supplied them with all the manna they could eat. And when Joshua had first led them into Canaan, they ate the food that was captured from the Canaanites. But now it's time to fend for themselves. So the Israelites found themselves watching their Canaanite neighbors in order to learn how to grow things. The problem was that the Canaanite, his success as a farmer was directly linked to the worship of his gods and goddesses. So these agricultural advisors insisted that the Israelites had to participate in the worship of Baal and his girlfriend Ashtaroth before they could have the conditions that were necessary to grow crops as well as they did. Now, the religion of the Canaanites was very depraved. It involved perverted sexual activity, and in some cases it even required offering children as human sacrifices. Well, at first the Israelites didn't exactly abandon the worship of Yahweh. They thought that they could worship God and Baal at the same time. See, they forgot the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. But as Israel got more and more involved in these pagan rituals, they thought less and less about God and more about messing around with the prostitutes that lived in the Canaanite temples. Well, eventually God would reach the end of His patience, and He would allow some foreign power to move in and take over Israel. This would usually shock the Israelites back to their senses, and they would repent and turn to God for help. Well, God would respond by raising up a hero who would rally the tribes together, and a period of repentance would set in, and that would be followed by a military victory that would restore Israel's control over the land once again. Unfortunately, after a relatively short period of time, Israel would start the cycle all over again. They would drift back into the old ways and start worshiping Baal again, and God would punish them once more. Eventually, they would repent again, and God would raise up another hero to save them. Now, last week, we read the story about how God used Deborah and Barak to defeat the Canaanites and end their 20-year oppression of Israel. This brought on a period of peace and prosperity that lasted for 40 years. By that time, most of the Israelites who were under 60 years old had no memory at all of the terrible oppression that they had suffered as a result of their disobedience to God. Plus, they never witnessed how God had been involved in the battles against the Canaanites. They started to think that the cloudburst that had destroyed Sisera's army, along with his 900 iron chariots, was nothing more than a coincidence. So this new generation began walking down their old path of disobedience. And as a result, the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. Over the years, critics of the Bible have claimed that the book of Judges is nothing more than good fiction. And as proof, they cite the fact that the events that are recorded in the book of Judges are not recorded by any secular historian. But modern-day archaeology has unearthed physical evidence that changed all that. With each new discovery, that the book of Judges is being proven to be an accurate historical account of the events that it describes. Now, at this particular time in history, Egypt is no longer as strong a power as it once was. It has become a very weak country. And the reason that it is weak is because the pharaohs at that time were very weak men. When Egypt was a world power, it had exerted its influence in the lands around it. This kept the raiding tribes of nomads in check. You see, the Egyptian army was in place to protect Egyptian colonies and trade routes in the Sinai Peninsula. Well, this controlling influence is now a thing of the past. This allows the nomadic tribes from the east to start moving into Israel. This movement was accelerated by the fact that the areas east of the Dead Sea had been suffering from a drought for 7 years. This had caused the tribes of nomads in the area to move west into Israel in order to find food, water, and whatever they could steal. Well, today's lesson deals with a particularly nasty bunch of nomads called Midianites. The Midianites didn't get their name from where they lived. They were the descendants of a man named Gideon. After Sarah's death, Abraham married a woman named Keturah, and Gideon was one of her sons. Now, if the term Midianites sounds familiar, it should. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, was called the priest of Midian. This made Moses' first wife, Zipporah, a Midianite. Over the years, the Midianites had gone from being a tribe of shepherds to being a bunch of vicious barbarians. And since they were nomads, they didn't stay in one place long enough to grow any food. So the Midianites survived by making war on anybody who was unlucky enough to get in their way. See, they stole what they needed. Well, the Midianites were very successful at what they did, and there were several reasons for that. First, their numbers. Whenever they moved, everybody moved. And there could be as many as a few million of them. Second, they had revolutionized the art of warfare by introducing the use of camels into military action. You see, they were among the first ones to use mounted cavalry. But instead of horses, their cavalry rode in on camels. You see, camels are strong and they're very fast and they don't require very much in the way of upkeep. And they could be used to haul away the loot after the battle. Since an adult camel can carry about 500 pounds, that means that they could carry an awful lot of loot. Well, chapter 6 starts off by telling us that the pattern of disobedience and punishment is repeating itself. Verse 1, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hands of Midian 7 years. Now, as I said earlier, the Midianites were nomads. When they came into Israel, their only interest was to steal provisions. You see, they made their living as raiders. They would steal whatever they needed, and Israel wasn't militarily strong enough to drive them out, so the Midianites pretty much did as they pleased. Well, this scenario was repeated over and over again. Israel would plant crops, then just as the harvest was wrapping up, the Midianites would roll in and take the crops away. They really didn't take the Hebrews captive, they just stole everything they had. Then they would return the next year and do the same thing. And the hand of Midian overpowered Israel, and because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves the dens that are in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. For whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and devour the produce of the land as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance for Israel, and no sheep or ox or donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents. They would come like locusts in number. Both they and their camels could not be counted, so they laid waste in the land as they came in. And Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the people of Israel cried out for help to the Lord. This constant raiding of the Midianites created a great economic hardship for the Israelites. Now let's go back to verses 2 to 4 for a minute. In order for the Israelites to keep some of the crops for themselves, they were forced into hiding. So they dug caves, then they would hide the goods in there. In many cases, they would actually live in the caves. And there was quite a lot of evidence supporting the fact that many of the Israelites lived in the caves during the time of the Judges. We have listened to the lies that archaeologists have fed to us over the years that portray cavemen as being big, hairy brutes that went around grunting at each other. But the only thing that makes a caveman is the fact he lives in a cave. Truth is, most cavemen were very sophisticated human beings that found it safer to live in a cave than in a hut. And in many cases, their ability to make the things that they needed to survive was far more sophisticated than our abilities are today. All right, look at verse 7. When the people of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of the Midianites. Since the Midianites would show up every year and steal everything that the Israelites produced, the people of Israel were getting hungry. So guess where they turned for help? Suddenly, Baal wasn't good enough. Israel was acting like a relative who only shows up when he needs something. So God sends an unnamed prophet to them, and this prophet's job was to remind Israel of all the things that God had done for them in the past. Look at verses 8 to 10. The Lord sent a prophet to the people of Israel, and he said to them, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery. And I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all that oppressed you, and drove them out before you, and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live, but you have not obeyed my voice." God says, I told you not to mess around with those Canaanite gods, but would you listen? No. In other words, he's telling them why he's allowing the Midianites to get the best of them. But God's gracious, so he sends another judge. Look at verse 11. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord is the pre-incarnate Christ. And the pre-incarnate Christ came down to earth and sits down under the terebinth tree that's near the place where a man named Gideon is threshing some wheat so he can hide it from the Midianites. But Gideon is probably one of the most interesting of the judges, but he's far from being the greatest. In fact, none of the judges were what you would call great people. I mean, they were ordinary people just like you and me. If the truth be known, they were totally inadequate for the job that God had called them to do, but it was probably their inadequacy that had prompted God to call them in the first place. You see, that way they wouldn't be tempted to take credit for the victory themselves. Now, God appeared to Gideon at a very embarrassing moment. Well, what could be so embarrassing about threshing wheat? I mean, after all, that's a pretty common thing to do in those days. But the fact that he's threshing grain isn't what's embarrassing. It's where he's doing it. Gideon is not introduced to us as the hero who is going to ride in and defeat the Midianites. See, look at where he's at. He's threshing wheat at a wine press. So, okay, so what? But you see, the wine press is the key to this situation. In those days, wine presses were always built at the bottom of a hill. That way, as they brought the grapes in from the fields, they didn't have to haul them up the hill. Doing that would have been too hard on the animals. So they would plant the grapes at the top of the hill, and when it came time to harvest the grapes, they would haul them down the hill to the wine press. That way, they only needed to haul the empty carts back up the hill. On the other hand, whenever you threshed wheat, you would toss the wheat into the air, and the wind would blow away the chaff, and the heavier grain would fall down to the floor. So threshing was always done at the top of the hill because that's where you would get the most benefit from the wind. And since wheat is a lot lighter than grapes, it wasn't hard on the animals to haul it up there. But here we have Gideon. He's at the bottom of the hill where there's very little wind, and he's trying to thresh the wheat without the Midianites seeing him. I mean, can you see the frustration that Gideon must have felt here? He throws the wheat up in the air, and there's hardly any wind to blow away the chaff, so it comes back down on top of him. He must have been grumbling all the time about being such a coward and looking at the top of the hill, wondering why he didn't have the guts to go up there. Look at verse 12. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." Verse 12 throws some humor into the otherwise pathetic situation. I mean, can you see the sarcasm here? "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." Gideon may have been a lot of things, but he was about as far away from being a mighty man of valor as you could get. He was actually a coward. When the Lord said, "O mighty man of valor," I'm sure Gideon looked around to see who he was talking to. It sure could be him. If Gideon really was a mighty man of valor, he would have been up on the top of the hill threshing the wheat in the wind instead of hiding in the winepress at the bottom of the hill. Well, Gideon responds in verse 13, and Gideon said to him, "Please, sir, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying?" Now, the fact that Gideon calls Christ "Sir" tells us that Christ appeared to him in human form. So Gideon probably thought that he was talking to a prophet and not to God himself. So he asked a question. "Lord, if God is with us, then why are all these bad things happening to us? I haven't seen God lift a finger lately to help us." But notice this. God didn't say that he was with Israel. He said that he was with Gideon, and that Gideon was going to defeat the Midianites. But Gideon's wondering, where are all these miracles that Granddaddy used to talk about? Gideon believed that God had abandoned Israel. But the fact is, it was Israel that had abandoned God. Remember, whenever you find yourself in a position where God doesn't seem to be anywhere around, God isn't the one that moved away. Well, if God was looking for a good candidate to save Israel from their oppressors, Gideon was the last person on earth that you would expect God to call on. He was skeptical, he was bitter, he was weak, and he wasn't very brave. Many Bible commentators will paint Gideon as a knight in shining armor who riding in on a mighty steed in order to rescue Israel from the Midianites. Fact is, he was more like a Don Quixote charging at windmills. But this is the man that God will use to save Israel, and God tells him so in verse 14. "And the Lord turned to him and said, Go in this might of yours, and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Did not I send you?" Did you notice the sarcasm's back again? And Christ finally reveals to Gideon that he's talking to God and not to a prophet. So in verse 15, it's no longer "Sir," it's "Lord." And we can look at verse 15 and see what Gideon's opinion of himself was. "And he said to him, Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least of my father's house." He says, "I can't do that. My tribe is the weakest in Israel, and my family is the weakest family in the tribe, and I'm the youngest in my family. Boy, Lord, did you make a big mistake." Gideon felt that he was the last man on earth that God should have called on to deliver him from the Midianites, and you know something? He was right. Our problem today is most of us are too strong for God to use. God only uses weak people. He only uses people who are willing to rely on Him for their strength. Paul wrote, "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God." God didn't choose the judges because they were capable people in and of themselves. He chose them because they realized that they weren't strong enough on their own. That way, they would need to rely on Him. I mean, do you find that encouraging? You should. If you think that we're strong enough on our own, then God can't use us, because if we succeed, we'll think that we did it on our own. But most of the time, God can't use us because we rely too much on our talent for God to use us. We take a job for God, then we try to do it according to our will and not His. There's something wrong with a Christian worker who is proud of what he does instead of giving God the credit. God will not use anything that the flesh produces on its own. Isaiah said that anything that we could accomplish in the strength of our flesh is no better than a pile of filthy rags in the sight of God. God only uses weak vessels. Then He gives them His strength. Just think about some of the people that God has used. I mean, take Moses, for example. He was a little baby in the bulrushes. He became a fugitive in Midian and spent 40 years tending sheep for his father-in-law Jethro. Moses wasn't a very ambitious man. I mean, after all, he'd been 40 years and he still didn't have a flock of his own. But God took Moses and he used him to defeat the most powerful nation on the face of the earth at that time. Look at Elijah. Elijah was not a weak vessel. So before God could use him, he took him into the wilderness to test him. Finally, God forced him to listen to a still small voice. Elijah was the type of man who liked the three-ring circuses. He wanted thunder from heaven. But God had to show Elijah that he can only use vessels that are weak in their own eyes. How about the Apostle Peter? I mean, would you have chosen Simon Peter? Peter had a character that was as weak as water. But God turned him into the rock by showing him his weaknesses. And Peter ended up preaching the first Christian sermon on the day of Pentecost. Nero was on the throne when Paul was beheaded in Rome. Sure looked like Nero had won. But history's already passed judgment in that case. I mean, we're willing to name our sons Paul, but we name our dogs Nero. God also uses a poor carpenter from a backwater village in Nazareth to save the world from sin. Well, Gideon was not a strong man. God is still going to use him to deliver Israel from the Midianites. Well, the first thing that God has to do is train Gideon. And lesson number 1 is designed to overcome Gideon's fear. Gideon isn't real sure that he believes what he's hearing. So he demands to see a sign from God so that he can be absolutely sure that God is the one he's dealing with. Remember, Gideon is dealing with a pre-incarnate Christ. And Christ has appeared to him in the form of a man. So Gideon wants to be sure that he is, in fact, dealing with God and not with some imposter. So Gideon asks an angel of the Lord to wait there until under the terebinth tree, until he returns with an offering, and he agrees. Well, Gideon prepares a young goat and some unleavened bread, and he lays it at the feet of the angel of God as an offering. And the angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened cakes and put them on this rock, and pour the broth over them," and he did. Then the angel reached out to the tip of the staff that was in his hand, touched the meat and the unleavened cakes, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes, and the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Well, when Gideon sees this, he shows us the kind of mighty man of valor he is. Gideon is scared to death. He realizes that he's seen God himself. From this point on, the word Lord translates the word Yahweh, which is the name of God. The Jews wouldn't say that name because they didn't want to take the chance of defiling it, so over the years they actually forgot how to pronounce it. They also forgot what it means. Some Bible scholars feel that it means self-existent one, but nobody really knows. All they know is it's God's name, and Gideon now understands that he is talking to God. So he figures that he's going to die. He looks at the fire of the offering, and he's sure that he's going to be the next candidate to become a crispy critter. But in verse 23, the angel of the Lord says, "Peace be to you, do not fear, you shall not die." So with that assurance, Gideon begins his big adventure. First thing he does is in verse 24. Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it the Lord of Peace. To this day it still stands at Ophrah, which belongs to the Abiezrites. Then that same night, God tells Gideon, "Take your father's bull and the second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it. And build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold here with the stones laid in due order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah that you shall cut down." Task number 1. He's to go to his father's house and destroy the altar to Baal and the Asherah pole that was beside it. Some translations use the term grove. My translation chose to use the actual Hebrew word Asherah instead. And Asherah was something like a totem pole. You see, in many pagan religions, you weren't allowed to box a god up inside of a temple. So most of the time, the ceremonies were held outdoors, usually in a grove of trees. Well, as the time went by, images were cut into the tree trunks. If no natural trees were available, wood poles were set up and they would carve the images of their gods into them. Many times these images were of the Ashtoreths. They were Baal's girlfriends. But when you stop and think about it, this shows us how the worship of God had really degenerated in Israel. After all, even Gideon's father was involved in the worship of Baal. He had even gone so far as to set up a pagan altar to the Canaanite gods on his property. Well, until God told him otherwise, I'm sure that Gideon himself didn't really see any conflict between the worship of Baal in order to guarantee a good crop and the worship of God for everything else. All right, look at verse 27 of chapter 6. So Gideon took 10 men of his servants, and did as the Lord had told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. Gideon is still showing us how really brave he is. This mighty man of valor is scared to death of what his father and the town people are going to do to him if he tears down the idols that they had set up in honor of the pagan gods. So he takes 10 men with him. You see, there's strength in numbers. And he does the deed at night. He's afraid that he might get caught. Now remember, these people linked the worship of Baal with the success of their crops. So they felt that if you did something that made Baal mad at you, you might go hungry that year. So Gideon figures that Daddy would be real mad if he thought that his son had done anything that might get Baal ticked off at him. Well, Gideon's plan didn't work. Somebody squealed. So the whole town finds out what he had done. And everyone in town is ready to execute Gideon. And everyone in town is standing there screaming, and they gather outside the father's house, and they demand that Gideon's father send him out. But to Gideon's surprise, his father actually defends him. Gideon had destroyed the altar to Baal. But see, nothing had happened to him. So Daddy begins to wonder if there's really anything to this Baal worship. Well, Daddy yells out to the crowd and says, will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down. Therefore, on that day, Gideon was called Jerubbaal. This is to say, let Baal contend against him because he broke down his altar. In other words, why are you guys fighting for Baal? If Baal is a real god, let him fight for himself. If Gideon has offended him, let Baal kill him. At that point, Gideon's father changes his son's name from Gideon to Jerubbaal, which means let Baal take care of him, and they leave. Now, why do you suppose that God would ask Gideon to do something that might upset Daddy and his friends to the point that they would want to kill him? Well, opposition from family and friends will very often make the struggle to serve God much more difficult. Jesus was quoting the prophet Micah when he said, and a person's enemies will be those of his own household. I have met many couples over the years where only one of them was a Christian. Most of the times it was the woman. And it's always a situation that's hard to cope with. This is especially true when the non-Christian spouse or their parents are following another religion. So God is putting Gideon up against the strongest opposition that he can face, his family and friends, and God sees him through it. Jesus went on to say, whoever loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Jesus wasn't saying that you need to hate your family in order to be a Christian, but he is saying that you need to love him more. So at this point, Gideon is feeling much more confident. His father has defended him. The townspeople didn't kill him. So at this point, Gideon is thinking that maybe God is really on his side. Now, remember what Gideon was doing when the angel of the Lord appeared to him. He was threshing wheat. That means it's harvest time. So right on schedule, the Midianites, along with their buddies, the Amalekites, begin to move into the valley of Jezreel, and they set up camp there. They're getting ready to steal the Israelites' crops again. Well, when Gideon hears about it, he blows a trumpet. And in Israel, blowing a trumpet was a signal for everyone to get ready to go to war. So when the Abiezrites hear the trumpet, the soldiers begin to gather. He also sends messengers to Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they turn out as well. Well, Gideon still isn't sure whether God really wants him to do this or not, so he asks God to give him another sign. This time, he asks God to cause the dew to wet a sheepskin that he will place on the threshing floor. But at the same time, he asks God to keep the area around it dry. And God did it. Now, just in case there was only a coincidence, Gideon asked God to do it a second time. But this time, he asked him to wet the threshing floor and leave the fleece dry. And God obliges him again. So Gideon is finally convinced that God is going to give Israel the victory. All right, let's move on to chapter 7. Gideon felt safe when he took 10 men along with him on his mission to destroy the altar of Baal that his father had set up in his house. But now he looks out at his army and he sees 32,000 men. Gideon was feeling real good. That is until he looked down at the Midianite camp and there was more men than he could even count. Remember, when they move, everybody moved. So I'm sure that Gideon began to wonder if 32,000 men were going to be enough. Well, what is Gideon doing here? He's starting to doubt God's power. So God gives Gideon the surprise of his life. The Lord said to Gideon, "The people with you are too many for me to give you the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.' Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, 'Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead.' Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained." I'm sure that Gideon's jaw must have dropped to the floor right about that. I mean, Lord, you got to be kidding. You can't be serious. I've only got 32,000 men, and the Midianites have more men than I can count, and you're telling me that I've got too many soldiers? Well, in Deuteronomy it says, "And the officers shall speak further to the people and say, 'Is there any man who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house, lest he make the heart of his fellows melt like his own.'" Law of Moses says that anyone who is afraid to go into battle after God has promised to be with them doesn't have enough faith. So he is to be excused. That way his doubt won't infect the rest of the soldiers. So God tells Gideon to get rid of the soldiers that are afraid to fight the Midianites. So Gideon says anyone who's afraid to fight can go home. And 22,000 of them packed their bags and head home. Given Gideon's disposition, it kind of makes you wonder why he didn't go home too. Well, that leaves him with 10,000 men. But God's not finished yet. And the Lord said to Gideon, "The people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And anyone whom I say to you, 'This one shall go with you,' shall go with you. And anyone of whom I say to you, 'This one shall not go with you,' shall not go." So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, "Everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink." And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink water. And the Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men who lapped, I will save you, and given the Midianites into your hands, and let all the others go, every man to his home." So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. I can just imagine Gideon's eyes getting as big as saucers and him saying, "Lord, you're kidding, right? This has got to be some kind of a joke. I mean, you're not laughing, Lord. How am I supposed to defeat this massive army with 300 men?" What we see here is a good example of God's election at work. God has chosen the men that he wants in Gideon's army. They each had to trust God enough to know that they can defeat the Midianites with 300 men because God told them that they could. And he lets them make the choice. God tells Gideon that the soldiers who get down on all fours to drink are to be rejected. The ones who remain standing and pick the water up in their cupped hands and then lap it out of their hands are the ones that God has chosen to accompany Gideon in the battle against the Midianites. Well, that seems to be a little stupid, right? I mean, what does drinking water have to do with a man's ability to fight? But it's more significant than you might think. You see, the men who lapped the water up out of their hands were the ones who were alert. They didn't want to sit down and take a chance that they would be attacked. They were ready to fight the Midianites. They knew that God was with them, so they were chomping at the bit to get going. They could drink later. On the other hand, the ones who got down on all fours to drink weren't in any big hurry. Their hearts really weren't in this anyway. They were probably wondering why they hadn't left with the other group. So they figure that they'll just sit down and take their time. Same thing works with salvation. God has elected those that He's going to save. The proof of their election is found in the fact that they are the ones who will accept Christ as their Lord and Savior. You see, God has given them the ability to accept the gospel when they hear it. The ones who refuse to accept Him aren't elect. You can argue about election and free will until the cows come home, but the fact is it works and it is scriptural. But you can't make it work by arguing about it. God chose who He wants in Gideon's army. But each one of those 10,000 men exercised his own free will in how they drank the water. God has made each one of us an offer. Accept Christ and be saved, or reject Christ and live in hell throughout eternity. You can accept Him if you want to. If you do, then that proves that you're among the elect, because you wouldn't have done that unless God had given you the desire to do that. And if you don't accept Him, that means that you're not elect. That is the way God works. Okay. Out of the 10,000 men who went to the river to drink, 9,700 of them got down on all fours to do it, and they went home. And this leaves Gideon with 300 men. But you know something? Even small groups, if they're dedicated to God and committed to the task at hand, can really do great things. Many small churches will compare themselves to Gideon's army, but they are not like Gideon's army at all. Every single man in Gideon's army was fully dedicated to the task at hand. By most standards, we are a small church, and we aren't getting any bigger because most of our people are down on all fours drinking water. There's nothing wrong with being a member of a small church unless you're content to be one. If a church has any desire to be successful, every member in it must be dedicated to saving the world. Being bigger for the sake of numbers isn't necessarily better. The quality of any effort made in God's name is always more important than the size of the effort. It would be much better for the cause of Christianity if there were fewer Christians, but much better ones. I mean, after all, about 10% of the church members do 90% of the work anyway, and there's something wrong with that. There should be no passengers on God's ship. No one should be on board simply to enjoy the ride. They should all be crew. But far too many people today come to the church for the sole purpose of having their needs met. The fact that the 10% who are working have to carry around the 90% who aren't hurts God's work terribly. That's especially true when you consider the fact that 90% are the ones doing the most complaining. They're the ones who demand the most from the church. So the 10% who are working for God are having to spend too much of their time trying to keep the 90% happy. Gideon's army had to be small enough so that if they were not being helped by God, their defeat would be assured. This way, no one but God can get the credit for their victory. Look at verses 9 to 15 of chapter 7. That same night, the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterwards your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp." I don't have to tell you that good old chicken-hearted Gideon was afraid to fight, so he takes his servant and they go down to the Midianite camp. And when they get there, they hear a couple of guards talking about a dream that one of them had. In the sentry's dream, a loaf of barley bread rolls down into the Midianite camp and knocks down a tent. Then he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outposts of the armed men who were at the camp. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. When Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade, and he said, behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian, and came to the tent, and struck it so that it fell, and turned it upside down so the tent lay flat. Well, the other guard offers the interpretation of the dream, and it doesn't sound like he has too much confidence in the Midianites' chances of winning a battle against Gideon's army. Maybe he doesn't know that Gideon's army now consists of a mere 300 men. And the comrade answered, this is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hands Midian and all the camp. Well, he says that the bread represents Gideon's army and the tent represents the raiding Midianites. In other words, the farmers of Israel are going to destroy the raiders of Midian. Well, that's all Gideon needs to hear. This convinces him that the time has come to fight. So he goes back to the Israelite camp, and he wakes everybody up, and he tells them to get ready to go and fight the Midianites. Well, this is his strategy. He divides his men into 3 groups of 100 men each. Each man is given a trumpet, a lamp, and a pitcher. He had each man place his lamp inside the pitcher so that the light could not be seen. Then he had each man hold his trumpet in his right hand and the pitcher with the lamp in his left hand. What is wrong with that picture? Notice that each soldier has both of his hands occupied. How is he going to fight the Midianites if his hands are full of horns and pitchers? He couldn't use the sword. Well, that really wasn't a problem. You see, nobody had a sword anyway. The Midianites had already stolen all the weapons in Israel. So Gideon has planned to fight with horns, lamps, and pitchers. Makes sense to me, right? Would you like to go into battle against a massive army with 300 men carrying trumpets, lamps, and pitchers? Well, here's how it's going to work. The Midianites were a loosely organized group of nomads. They didn't really have a centralized leadership. They would also be very few guards posted at their camp. You see, they really didn't feel that Israel was much of a threat to them. In fact, they weren't expecting Israel to be bold enough to attack them at all, so most of them were asleep. Well, Gideon posted his 3 bands of men in various points around the Midianite camp, and at his signal, they would all blow their trumpet and break their pitchers so that the lamps would now be visible. Now, to the half-asleep Midianites, each trumpet represents several hundred men, and the lights give the impression that they were surrounded. The breaking pitchers also made enough noise that it seemed that there was a large number of men attacking them. Look at verse 22. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army, and the army fled. It was dark. No one could see very well. They had no central leadership. So when the Midianites heard all that noise, they came running out of their tents, sword in hand, and they started hacking away at anything that moved. As a result, they killed each other. So before too long, the Midianites had really defeated themselves. And all that Gideon's 300 men had to do was sit by and watch. Gideon had won the war without even drawing a sword. Now, there are some spiritual lessons to be learned here. First, let's look at the pitchers and the lamps. Paul wrote, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay." Those pitchers represent the body of believers. It says we have this treasure. Well, what treasure? The treasure of the light of Christ is placed within the clay jar that we call the body. Some of us aren't broken, so the light can't get out. Well, the light isn't our light. It's the light of Christ that's within us. And the light can only shine through a broken life. It's a life that is devoid of pride, relies totally on God for its strength and its salvation. The trumpets represent our witness to the world. Paul wrote, "And if the bugle gives an indistinct sound, who will get ready for battle?" The testimony of a Christian, it must be certain and it must be clear. Unfortunately, that's not always the way it is. Churches today tolerate all sorts of sin. So how can they call the world to repent and turn away from sin when the church itself is tolerating it? Do as I say and not as I do just does not cut it. Remember, the only Bible that many people will ever read is the Bible they see acted out in your life. It's also very hard to send a clear and accurate message to the world if you have no idea what that message is. And most churchgoers today are biblically illiterate, and they have no desire to attend a Bible study to correct that problem. Is your trumpet in tune? Or are you playing beautiful music, or are you blowing sour notes? Well, today most people seem to feel that as long as they're obedient in the big things, the small things really don't matter that much. But small things do matter. Amelia Earhart was attempting to fly around the world in 1937, but her navigator missed Howland Island by less than 1 degree on the compass. She was supposed to refuel there, but that little 1 degree error caused her to miss a mark, and she couldn't get fuel. Andrew Johnson took over as the 17th President of the United States after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. But he wasn't very honest, so the House of Representatives voted to impeach him in February of 1868. He was saved from being thrown out of office by one vote. One little mole burrowed a hole into a levee in the Red River and caused a 50-foot section of the levee to collapse. The world's first computer weighed several tons, and it was installed at Harvard University. Well, in September of 1947, it suddenly stopped working. Turned out, a moth had gotten into the computer and shorted out one of the circuits. That's why computer glitches today are called bugs. And the engineers at Harvard University fixed history's very first computer bug in September of 1947, and in that case it happened to be a real bug. Did you know that two men invented the telephone at the same time? I mean, we all know about Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, but nobody ever heard of Elisha Gray. Elisha Gray invented his own version of the telephone at the same time that Bell invented it. Bell beat him to the patent office by 2 hours. Only 2 hours, and today we read about Alexander Graham Bell's invention and not Elijah Gray's. The building of the Grace Baptist Church and then the Temple University in Philadelphia was started with a donation of 57 cents that was given by a little girl named Hattie White. You see, the little things do count. And that's especially true when it comes to keeping our witness for God true. Well, in chapter 8 continues the story of Gideon. This chapter records the events that took place after the defeat of the Midianites, and verses 22 to 24 are significant. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." And Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And Gideon said to them, "Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil," for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Israel asked Gideon to be their king. This is the first indication that the people were leading in that direction. Well, in verse 23, Gideon refuses. But in verse 24, he asks for the gold earrings that had been taken from the Midianites. Then Gideon makes an ephod out of the gold. Now the vest that the high priest wore was called an ephod. But God didn't give the instructions for the ephod until after the Hebrews had left Egypt and were in the wilderness of Sinai. But the Hebrew word ephod simply means image. So we really don't know exactly what it was that Gideon made. But we do know that he set it up in his hometown of Ophrah, and that Israel eventually worshipped the ephod instead of God. We also find out in chapter 8 that Gideon went on to have many wives and at least one concubine. His wives bore him 69 sons, and I'm sure there were a few girls in there too. All of these things were real blots on Gideon's life. It was God's intention for a family to be one man and one woman for one lifetime. He didn't take all of Adam's ribs, he only took one. And he used it to make one woman, Eve, and he did not make Adam and Steve either. You know, this only shows us that the Bible couldn't have been written by men. God tells it like it is. If a man had written this account about Gideon's exploits, do you honestly think that he would have included that information? Of course not. They would have left out those parts, but God didn't. You know, it should be encouraging for us to hear about the flaws in some of the people that God used. It makes them think that he might be able to use me too. Well, did the Israelites learn their lesson? No. We'll read in verses 33 to 35. As soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. And the people of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hand of all the enemies on every side. And they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good thing that he had done to Israel. In spite of all that God had done for them, the cycle was starting all over again.